Well, tensions are escalating in Los Angeles as clashes flare up in the U.S. city shortly after President Trump's controversial move to send in the National Guard.
He has also not ruled out deploying active duty Marines. And the president says it's for law and order.
The move is against anti-deportation protesters, but also against the wishes of California Governor Gavin Newsom.
Tear gas fired as protesters clashed with the National Guard and police, and the military reserves were deployed after a second night of demonstrations against immigrant raids. 300 guards are in the city. At least 2,000 are expected.
This is the first time in 60 years that a U.S. president has bypassed a local governor to send in troops. Mr. Trump vowed consequences for protesters who abuse officers.
Let's cross over now to L.A., where Philip Crowther is live for us there. Philip, could you give us the latest on where you are right now, and how has the presence of the National Guard affected the situation?
Well, look, this is the scene in downtown L.A. right now, where there have been protests for the last few hours, and also the presence of the police department from Los Angeles, who you can see behind me right now. There's essentially a standoff right now between them using what we identify as rubber bullets right now and shooting toward actually a group of protesters up the road. They are using some makeshift barricades there. These are essentially traffic signs, construction signs that they are using and shielding themselves from these rubber bullets. In the meantime, we're surrounded by protesters here who also have had some of those rubber bullets aimed at them. You can see these police officers. There are hundreds of them right now on the streets of downtown LA, some on horseback as well. And they are trying to push these protesters away as much as possible. What you're not seeing here right now are members of the National Guard. They essentially have been brought in here to the city of Los Angeles to protect federal buildings, the detention center, for example, where illegal immigrants who had been rounded up by the immigration forces here in LA are being held right now. That's one of the buildings that they are trying to protect. We're not seeing them in a direct standoff with protesters, but the LA Police Department certainly is here, and you can see them wielding their so-called less lethal weapons right now. These are essentially rubber bullets that we are seeing that are being deployed here. Tear gas a little bit earlier today, but we haven't seen any signs of that over the last few hours.
Philip, I want to ask you a bit about the National Guard deployment. They are going to be there, deployed for at least 60 days. Presumably, they're going to be confronting protesters, trying to break up demonstrations and perhaps arrest some of the protesters as well. But what else are they going to be doing apart from all that?
Well, what we've seen in the past, when there have been mass protests that have turned violent in other cities in the United States, Baltimore, for example, comes to mind, or Ferguson, Missouri as well. What we've seen when there has been National Guard deployed is that they essentially protect buildings, federal buildings, be it office buildings, but also prisons, for example. They don't necessarily get into direct confrontation with protesters. As we can see here, it is the LA Police Department that is largely doing that right now. As we speak, we are seeing some of the police officers seemingly aiming towards this group of protesters that is close to us. So we're just going to get down here, but we'll continue shooting here, and we'll be able to tell you what is happening. So essentially what's being used here are rubber bullets, and this is what's making protesters run away into the distance, trying to get them away from this intersection right here. Again, you asked me about the National Guard. This is not the National Guard doing this right now. They might be asked to do so in the future. At this point, we know that there are a few hundred National Guard troops here in Los Angeles right now. There are expected to be 2,000 altogether. That at least is the order that came from U.S. President Donald Trump. They haven't all arrived here yet. But from what we're seeing here today, things can, of course, escalate as they are right now. And maybe the federal government will believe that there will be more troops that will be needed here on the ground in L.A.
Yeah, Philip, clearly a volatile situation unfolding behind you. If you need to move to a safer place, do let us know. But in the meantime, I do want to ask you about California Governor Gavin Newsom. He has formally requested the National Guard deployment to be rescinded. I mean, what do we know about that? What's the likelihood of that happening?
Well, this is a big political fight that we're seeing here, essentially, between the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, and the president of the United States, Donald Trump. The reason for this is when the National Guard is deployed, usually it is the governor of the state that decides, not the president of the United States. In this case, it was the president, Donald Trump, who decided to go over the head of the governor of California and decided to bring in the National Guard to this city of Los Angeles. The fact that Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is telling the president to rescind that order, I don't think is going to go anywhere. National Guard troops are on their way into Los Angeles rather than on their way out. We'll have to wait and see, of course, whether these protests continue, whether they get worse, possibly more violent, whether they lead to more people joining these protesters in the streets. That's unknown right now.
Philip, Gavin Newsom wants control returned to him, to the state. Does he have a plan? Has he presented a plan, to the president, to stop these protests which are taking place as we speak?
No, there isn't necessarily a plan, except that the governor of California and the local authorities here, and that includes the mayor of the city, say they have enough power here. They have enough police forces, the ones you can see right behind me now. They think they have enough of them to be able to take control of this situation. They are saying they do not need the National Guard troops here on the ground in Los Angeles. What they are saying is that what the president, Donald Trump, has done is an escalation of the situation rather than helping it.
And Philip,
we'll just move out of the way a little bit now, if you don't mind.
Please take your time, Philip. And should other immigrant-friendly... All right. A very volatile situation there. Philip, we will let you go so that you can move to somewhere safer. That was Philip Crowther live for us in Los Angeles. Do stay safe.
Well, Jean Lance-Reese is co-director at the USC Immigration Clinic and clinical associate professor of law at USC Gould School of Law. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. I want to start by asking you about, I suppose, a bit of a historical precedent. The last time a U.S. president called in the National Guard without a request from the governor was in 1965. Lyndon Johnson did it. But I'm curious, are there parallels right now with California's situation?
There are. Many consider this an outsized response. The calling in of the National Guard in the 1960s was because the state was not following federal law. Here, I think there's a really big question about whether this is preventing the enforcement of law or protesting. To remind you, immigration law is a civil law. There's questions about whether or not these kind of escalated military-type immigration raids are violating people's constitutional rights. So there's not very strong parallels where the state of California is refusing to allow officials to enforce some kind of federal law. I think that this is an outsized response, and there was kind of a statement by the state in the last time that the National Guards were deployed against a state's wishes, that the governor said, we are not going to integrate schools. So this was school segregation. In order to integrate the schools, the National Guard was called out to enforce that, where the governor of that state said, we aren't allowing you to integrate schools. California is still cooperating with the Department of Homeland Security in their enforcement operations. They're still obeying certain kinds of voluntary requests for holding people who've been non-citizens who are in violation of immigration law, who have been accused of crimes, for example. So that is not the case here. So this is an outsized response to what is happening.
Sure, Professor, and like you mentioned, this is a rare use of federal force on U.S. soil, and there's legal uncertainty about whether the president can federalize the Guard without the governor's consent. But is this even legal?
Well, there is laws that allow the federal government to federalize the National Guard when there's this kind of a domestic violence, disobeying the laws, some sort of conspiracy. But the ultimate question is that what's taking place? What we're seeing are protests of really kind of militarized tactics to arrest people who are present in the U.S. in violation of immigration law. Immigration law is a civil law. It's not a criminal law. And the stakes are very high. You're seeing neighbors, families being pulled apart. And so the protests are escalating in kind to the government escalating. And I think that this is not a situation that so I guess to answer your question, the federal government can nationalize the Guard, but there is a question as to whether it's warranted in this particular circumstance.
Right. This is a third day of protests underway in LA, but do you see this as merely a short-term security response, or could it be the start of a broader effort, perhaps even a test case for future crackdowns?
I'm concerned about the escalation. I think we're going to see more targeted locations in Southern California for immigration enforcement. And the question is, will the National Guard be involved? And that could be very dangerous if the National Guard goes from protecting federal buildings to, enforcing law on the streets against the residents of California. I don't see this government backing down at all. I do think that this is part of a kind of optics to kind of contribute to this narrative of a migrant invasion, of immigrants causing harm, being criminals. But the reality is the reports we have of the people who've been arrested, they're working in our communities, and they're not part of some sort of threat to national security. I'm not saying all of them, but I think that's I think this is kind of a optics opportunity for this government to really make an example of Los Angeles, where there might not be a basis for the allegations that this is, an invasion.
Professor, I mean, at this time, this is restricted, if you like, to immigration. I'm wondering if you are concerned about the broader implications of what's been happening. I mean, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth talking about mobilizing nearby Marines. I mean, they're on standby, not necessarily mobilized yet. But I guess the question and the concern is, I mean, what could happen when the military is used in this manner against domestic dissent and protests, in I guess, wider sectors of society and life?
Well, there's a big concern that people who are trained in military operations are going to use excessive force against civilians, and that will cause violence. It will cause injuries and deaths. There have been occasions, for example, where the military was deployed at the southern border and killed a child who was a U.S. citizen herding goats. And it's kind of this, when you have someone trained for combat, to then be turning those skills on residents, especially residents who are protesting a very controversial and perhaps unconstitutional use of force. And I think with the escalation, there's also additional federal laws suspending habeas corpus, national emergencies that could give the opportunity for the government to perhaps exceed its authority based on kind of an outbreak of violence in this way.
Okay, and Professor, LA isn't the only city grappling with immigration raids. We've heard strong criticism from the Trump administration about sanctuary policies in cities like Chicago, Boston, and Denver. Could this unrest spread to other cities?
It could. I mean, one thing I'll say about sanctuary cities or sanctuary states, it's a bit of a misnomer because the states can't prevent the federal government from coming in and enforcing immigration law. What we're seeing is protesting against the way that it's being enforced. These are not normal operations the way that we have seen these raids happen, and many have been without warrants. So other states can anticipate that, if only to kind of make an example of them. But I'd like to reiterate, even under California's sanctuary law, California government really does cooperate with the Department of Homeland Security when it comes to immigration enforcement. So I think that there is a lot of spectacle happening here that is kind of fanning the flames of emotional responses, and we're dealing with human lives as well. So it's an opportunity for kind of this the president's narrative to expand, where I think the facts on the street are different than what's presented in the news.
Okay, Professor Reese, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your time. Jean Len Cerise, Clinical Associate Professor of Law at USC Gould School of Law. Thank you.